compound sat in darkness, hidden among the rocky hills of the Afghan province. Lieutenant Sarah Chen pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her breath forming small clouds in the freezing night air. She was 28 years old, and one of the few female Navy SEALs in active combat operations. Her team had been tracking a high-value target for 3 months, and tonight was the night they would finally close in. The intelligence reports said the target was inside the compound with at least 12 armed fighters. What the reports didn't mention was the woman being held hostage in the basement. Sarah only learned about her 2 hours ago when a local informant sent an urgent message. The woman was an aid worker from Germany who had been kidnapped 6 days earlier while delivering medical supplies to a nearby village. Sarah's team leader, Commander Richards, had given her a direct order. Get in, extract the hostage, and get out. The rest of the team would handle the target and his men. It sounded simple on paper, but Sarah knew better. Nothing was ever simple in these situations. She moved silently along the wall, her rifle held ready. The night vision goggles turned the world into shades of green, making every shadow look like a potential threat. Behind her, 3 other SEALs followed in perfect formation. They had trained together for years, and each member knew exactly what the others would do in any situation. The compound had 3 buildings, ranged in a U-shape around a central courtyard. The main house was where the target stayed. The hostage was being held in a smaller building to the left, according to their intel. Sarah's job was to reach that building while the main assault team created a distraction at the front gate. She checked her watch. 2 minutes until the assault began. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady. Fear was natural, but panic would get people killed. She had learned that lesson during her first deployment, and it had kept her alive through 12 missions since then. The informant had told them something else, something that made Sarah's blood run cold. The hostage was being used as leverage against her organization. If they didn't receive a ransom payment by dawn, the woman would be executed. That gave Sarah's team less than 4 hours to complete the mission. She reached the corner of the compound wall and paused. 2 guards stood near the entrance to the courtyard, smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices. They looked relaxed, unprepared for what was about to happen. Sarah signaled to her teammate, Petty Officer James Morrison, who moved into position with his suppressed rifle. 1 minute left. Sarah's radio earpiece crackled softly. Commander Richards' voice came through, calm and professional. All teams were in position. The assault would begin exactly on schedule. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared herself for what came next. The explosion at the front gate shattered the night's silence. The 2 guards in the courtyard immediately dropped their cigarettes and ran toward the sound, shouting orders to others inside the buildings. Sarah didn't waste a second. She sprinted across the open ground, toward the smaller building, her boots making almost no sound on the packed dirt. Morrison and the other 2 team members, Sanchez and Wu, followed close behind. They reached the building's door just as gunfire erupted from the main house. The assault team had engaged the enemy fighters, and the entire compound had turned into a war zone. Sarah tried the door handle. Locked. She stepped back, while Morrison placed a small explosive charge on the hinges. 3 seconds later, the door blew inward with a muffled thump. Sarah went through first, her rifle sweeping the dark interior. The building was larger than it looked from outside. A narrow hallway stretched ahead with several doors on either side. Sarah moved quickly, checking each room. Empty, empty, empty. Her team cleared the ground floor in less than 30 seconds. No hostage. Then she saw the stairs leading down. The basement. Sarah descended carefully, each step measured and silent. The sounds of gunfire from outside were muffled now, distant. Down here, she could hear something else. Voices. Someone was crying at the bottom of the stairs. A heavy wooden door blocked her path. Light showed through the crack underneath. Sarah positioned herself to the side and nodded to Morrison. He kicked the door open, and Sarah went in fast. The room was small and dirty, lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. A woman sat on the floor in the corner, her hands tied behind her back. She had blonde hair matted with dirt and blood, and her face was bruised. But she was alive. Standing next to the hostage was a man Sarah hadn't expected to see. He wasn't one of the regular fighters. He wore expensive clothes and had a clean-shaven face. More importantly, he had a pistol pressed directly against the hostage's head. His finger was on the trigger. His eyes were wide with fear and anger. Sarah's rifle was already aimed at him, but she couldn't take the shot. Not with the gun at the hostage's head. One twitch of his finger, and the woman would be dead. Sarah had faced many dangerous situations in her career, but this was different. This required something other than firepower. The man started shouting in Pashto, his voice high and panicked. Sarah didn't speak the language fluently, but she understood enough. He was demanding that they leave, threatening to kill the hostage if they took one step closer. His hand was shaking, and Sarah knew that made him even more dangerous. A scared man with a gun was unpredictable. She lowered her rifle slowly, holding up one hand in a peaceful gesture. Morrison and the others held their positions behind her, weapons ready, but not aimed directly at the man. Sarah spoke calmly in English, keeping her voice steady and non-threatening. She told him they weren't there to hurt him. They just wanted the woman. If he let her go, he could walk away. Sarah was lying, of course. The man would be detained and questioned, possibly facing charges for kidnapping and terrorism. But right now, the lie might save the hostage's life. The man wasn't buying it. He shouted again, pressing the gun harder against the woman's temple. The hostage whimpered, tears streaming down her face. Sarah could see the terror in her eyes. It's the absolute certainty that she was about to die. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. She could try to rush him, but he would pull the trigger before she covered the distance. Morrison could try for a headshot, but the angle was wrong, and any miss would hit the hostage. They needed the man to move the gun, even for just a second. Then Sarah noticed something. The man kept glancing at the doorway behind her, toward the stairs. He was listening to the gunfire outside, calculating his chances. He was thinking about running. That gave Sarah an idea. She started speaking again, this time in broken Pashto, mixing in words she remembered from her language training. She told him the compound was surrounded. His friends upstairs were already dead or captured. The only way out was through a deal. She would personally escort him to safety if he released the hostage. The man's eyes darted between Sarah and the doorway. His grip on the pistol loosened slightly. Not much, but enough for Sarah to notice. She took a small step forward, still talking, still keeping her voice calm and reasonable. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. But Sarah would remember every detail for the rest of her life. The man made his decision. He started to move the gun away from the hostage's head, turning it towards Sarah instead. That was his fatal mistake. Sarah had been waiting for exactly this moment. The instant the gun moved away from the hostage, she acted. Her hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist and forcing the pistol toward the ceiling. At the same time, she drove her knee into his stomach with all her strength. The man doubled over, gasping for air. And Sarah twisted the gun from his grip in one smooth motion. Morrison was on him in an instant. Forcing the man to the ground and zip-tying his hands behind his back, Sanchez and Wu secured the room while Sarah knelt beside the hostage. She cut the ropes binding the woman's hands and helped her to her feet. The hostage was shaking uncontrollably. But she managed to whisper a thank you in heavily accented English. Sarah gave her a quick once-over, checking for serious injuries. Apart from the bruises and dehydration, she seemed okay. They needed to move fast, though. The fighting outside was still going on, and they had to get the hostage out of the compound before reinforcements arrived. Sarah spoke into her radio, confirming the hostage was secure and they were moving to the extraction point. Commander Richards responded immediately. The assault team had neutralized most of the enemy fighters, but a few had barricaded themselves in the main house and were putting up heavy resistance. Sarah made a quick decision. They couldn't wait for the fighting to end. She would take the hostage out through the back of the compound while the assault team kept the remaining fighters occupied. Morrison would come with her. While Sanchez and Wu would deliver their prisoner to the command post, they moved quickly through the basement and up the stairs. The building was still clear, but Sarah could hear shouts and gunfire from the courtyard. She led the group to a back door that opened onto a narrow alley between the building and the compound wall. According to the maps they had studied, this alley led to a small gate used for deliveries. The hostage was struggling to keep up, weak from her ordeal, so Morrison lifted her and carried her on his back. Sarah took point, her rifle ready for any threat. They moved down the alley, staying close to the wall's shadow. They were halfway to the gate when Sarah heard footsteps running toward them from ahead. Someone was coming from outside the compound. She signaled for Morrison to stop and take cover behind a pile of crates. Sarah positioned herself at the corner, ready to engage whoever appeared. 3 men rounded the corner, all carrying weapons. They were running toward the sound of gunfire, probably reinforcements who had been stationed nearby. Sarah had maybe 2 seconds before they spotted her team. She made another quick decision. Sarah opened fire before the men could react. Her training took over, muscle memory guiding every movement. 3 quick bursts from her rifle, each one perfectly aimed. The first man dropped instantly. Second managed to raise his weapon before Sarah's rounds found their target. The third tried to run back the way he came. Morrison took him down with a single shot from his position behind the crates. The entire encounter lasted maybe 5 seconds. But those 5 seconds changed everything. The sound of gunfire in the alley would alert everyone in the compound to their position. Sarah's team had lost the element of surprise, and now they had to move fast or risk getting trapped. Morrison adjusted his grip on the hostage and started running toward the gate. Sarah covered their retreat, moving backwards and keeping her rifle aimed at the corner where more enemies might appear at any second. Her radio crackled with urgent voices. The assault team had heard the gunfire and wanted to know her status. Sarah reported quickly while moving. 3 hostiles down, hostage secure, moving to extraction point Alpha. Commander Richards acknowledged and told her to hurry. Intelligence had just picked up radio chatter indicating that a larger force was heading toward the compound. They had maybe 10 minutes before the entire area would be swarming with enemy fighters. They reached the gate. A heavy wooden door set into the compound wall. Sarah tried the handle, but it was locked from the outside with a chain and padlock. She swore under her breath and looked around for another option. They could climb the wall, but not with the hostage in her current condition. Morrison set the woman down gently and pulled out a small cutting tool from his pack. He went to work on the padlock while Sarah kept watch. Every second felt like an hour. She could hear shouts from inside the compound getting closer. Someone had found the bodies in the alley. The cutting tool made a grinding noise that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Sarah wanted to tell Morrison to hurry, but she knew he was working as fast as possible. The hostage sat against the wall, her eyes closed, probably praying or trying to block out the reality of their situation. Finally, the padlock gave way with a loud snap. Morrison pushed the gate open, and Sarah saw their extraction vehicle waiting on the other side, exactly where it was supposed to be. The driver, a SEAL named Patterson, had the engine running and the back doors open. Morrison helped the hostage into the vehicle while Sarah provided cover, scanning the darkness for any threats. Just as she was about to climb in herself, she heard the unmistakable sound of someone chambering around behind her. She spun around, bringing her rifle up, and found herself face to face with a young boy, maybe 14 years old, holding an AK-47 that looked too big for his small frame. The boy's hands were shaking. His finger was on the trigger. Sarah could see the fear and confusion in his eyes. He was just a kid, probably forced into this situation by circumstances beyond his control. But he also had a loaded weapon pointed at her chest. And Sarah knew that scared kids pulled triggers just as easily as trained soldiers. Time seemed to slow down. Sarah had her rifle aimed at the boy, her finger resting on the trigger. She could take the shot easily, eliminate the threat before he could fire. It would be justified by any measure of combat rules. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way the boy's lip trembled, or the tears she could see forming in the corners of his eyes. Sarah made a choice that went against every tactical instinct she had. She slowly lowered her rifle and held up both hands, palms out, showing the boy she meant no harm. She spoke to him softly, using the few Pashto words she knew. Peace, safe home. The words sounded clumsy in her mouth. but she hoped the tone would communicate what the words couldn't. The boy's rifle wavered, dipping slightly as confusion replaced the fear on his face. Sarah took a small step to the side, moving away from the vehicle and the hostage. If the boy was going to shoot someone, it would be her, not the innocent woman they had just rescued. Morrison hissed at her from the vehicle, telling her to get in, but Sarah ignored him. She kept her eyes locked on the boy, trying to communicate without words that he had a choice here. He didn't have to pull that trigger. He didn't have to become someone who killed people tonight. Behind the boy, Sarah could see flashlight beams dancing in the darkness. The fighters from the compound were searching the alley, and they would reach this position in seconds. Sarah had to make a decision. She could shoot the boy and get in the vehicle, or she could trust that he would let them go. The boy's eyes darted between Sarah and the vehicle behind her. His finger tightened on the trigger, and Sarah tensed, ready to move if he fired. But then something changed in the boy's expression. The fear turned to something else, maybe understanding, or maybe just exhaustion with the violence he had been forced to participate in. He lowered the rifle slowly, letting it hang from the strap across his shoulder. Then he turned and ran in the opposite direction, disappearing into the darkness. Sarah didn't waste time analyzing what had just happened. She jumped into the vehicle. Patterson hit the gas before the door was even fully closed. They raced away from the compound, bouncing over the rough terrain. Sarah looked back through the rear window and saw figures emerging from the gate, silhouetted against the fires burning inside the compound. Gunfire erupted, bullets pinging off the vehicle's armored sides. But Patterson swerved expertly, putting distance between them and the shooters. The hostage was crying now, great heaving sobs of relief and trauma. Morrison had his arm around her shoulders, speaking softly, trying to calm her down. Sarah sat in silence, her mind replaying the encounter with the boy. She had gambled with all their lives in that moment, trusting a child soldier to make the right choice. It could have ended very differently. Her radio crackled again. Commander Richards reported that the assault team had successfully captured the high-value target and was moving to their own extraction point. The mission was a success. They had gotten the hostage out alive, neutralized the terrorist cell, and captured their target. By any measure, it was a textbook operation, but Sarah couldn't shake the image of that boy's face from her mind. How many other kids were out there, forced to carry weapons and make impossible choices? How many of them would make the wrong choice because they didn't have any other option? These were questions that didn't have easy answers. Questions that Sarah would wrestle with long after this. Mission ended. The vehicle reached the main road and turned toward the base, accelerating now that they were on solid pavement. Sarah finally allowed herself to relax slightly, though she kept her rifle ready and her eyes scanning the darkness. The mission wasn't over until they were back inside the wire, and she had learned never to let her guard down too early. The hostage had stopped crying and was now staring out the window with a blank expression. Shock, probably. Sarah had seen it before in rescued hostages. The mind's way of protecting itself from trauma by shutting down unnecessary emotions. The woman would need medical attention and probably months of therapy to process what she had been through. Morrison caught Sarah's eye and nodded once. A silent acknowledgement of what she had done back at the gate. He didn't say anything, but Sarah knew he was thinking the same thing she was. They had both seen too many child soldiers in their deployments, kids who never got the chance to choose differently. They arrived at the base 45 minutes later. Medical personnel were waiting at the gate. They immediately took charge of the hostage, loading her onto a stretcher and rushing her to the base hospital. Sarah and Morrison went through the standard debriefing process, reporting everything that had happened during the mission. When Sarah mentioned the encounter with the boy, the intelligence officer taking her report paused and looked at her carefully. He asked if she could identify the boy, describe him in detail. Sarah shook her head. It had been dark, and everything happened so fast. The officer made a note in his file and moved on to the next question. Later, after the debriefing was complete and she had cleaned her weapons and gear, Sarah returned to her quarters. She sat on her bunk in the darkness, too wired to sleep despite the exhaustion that pulled at every muscle. Her hands were finally shaking now, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving behind the reality of how close they'd come to disaster. She thought about the man in the basement, the one who had held the gun to the hostage's head. In that moment, he had made a choice to threaten an innocent life, and that choice had consequences. He was now in custody, facing justice for his actions. But what about the boy at the gate? He had made a different choice, one that showed mercy and wisdom beyond his years. Sarah wondered what would happen to that boy. Would he go back to the compound and be punished for letting them escape? Would he run away and try to find a different life? Or would he simply pick up his rifle again tomorrow and continue on the path that had been chosen for him by others? These thoughts circled in Sarah's mind as she finally drifted off to sleep, the sounds of the bass humming around her. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over the Afghan mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Another day was beginning, bringing with it new missions, new challenges, and new impossible choices. The hostage spent 3 days in the base hospital before being transferred to Germany for further treatment. Sarah visited her once before she left, wanting to make sure she was okay. The woman was sitting up in bed, looking much better than she had in that basement. Her bruises were healing, and the color had returned to her face. When Sarah entered the room, the woman's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude, not fear. She reached out and grabbed Sarah's hand, squeezing it tightly. She tried to speak, to express what she was feeling, but the words came out jumbled in a mix of German and English. Sarah understood anyway. She had saved this woman's life, given her a second chance that she would never forget. The woman would carry the scars of her ordeal, both physical and mental, for the rest of her life. But she would also carry the memory of that moment when Sarah had burst through the door. When hope had appeared in what seemed like a hopeless situation, Sarah stayed for only a few minutes, not wanting to tire the woman out. As she was leaving, the woman asked her a question. She wanted to know if Sarah had been scared down in that basement, with the gun pointed at her head. Sarah smiled slightly and answered honestly. Yes, she had been terrified. But fear was just part of the job, something you learned to work through rather than avoid. Back in her quarters that night, Sarah received a message from Commander Richards. The intelligence officers had been analyzing communications intercepted after the raid, and they had discovered something interesting. The man who had held the gun to the hostage's head wasn't just a random fighter. He was the target's brother, someone who had managed to avoid detection until now. By capturing him, they had dealt a significant blow to the terrorist network operating in the region. The brother had already started cooperating, providing information about other cells and planned attacks. Sarah's decision to negotiate rather than simply storm the room had not only saved the hostage, but it also yielded valuable intelligence that would save many. More lives in the future. 3 weeks passed before Sarah learned what happened to the young boy who had let them escape. The information came from an unexpected source, a local translator who worked with the base intelligence unit. He had heard rumors from his contacts in the nearby villages, stories about a boy who had defied the fighters and was now being hunted by them. Sarah listened carefully as the translator explained what he knew. The boy had returned to the compound that night, but had lied about what happened. He claimed that the Americans had overwhelmed him and knocked him unconscious before escaping. Some of the fighters believed him, but others were suspicious. The boy had sensed their doubt and had run away 3 days later, disappearing into the mountains. Now he was reportedly living with relatives in a village 40 miles to the north, trying to start a new life away from the violence that had consumed his childhood. Sarah felt relief wash over her when she heard this. The boy had chosen a different path, and somehow he had survived that choice. It was a small victory in a war full of tragedies, but Sarah held on to it anyway. Commander Richards called a team meeting that afternoon. They gathered in the briefing room, the same space where they had planned the compound raid just weeks earlier. Sarah sat next to Morrison, with the rest of the team filling the chairs around the conference table. Richard stood at the front, a serious expression on his weathered face. He told them they were being reassigned. A new mission had come down from command, something bigger than the usual raids and patrols. A humanitarian convoy was traveling through a dangerous region to deliver supplies to remote villages. Intelligence suggested that a terrorist group was planning to ambush the convoy and kidnap the aid workers for ransom or propaganda purposes. The team's job was to provide covert security. For the convoy, without the aid workers knowing they were there, they would shadow the vehicles from a distance, ready to respond if an attack occurred. It was a complex mission that would require days of careful movement through hostile territory, and any mistake could result in the very kidnapping they were trying to prevent. Sarah studied the maps and intelligence reports that Richards distributed. The convoy route passed through several known danger zones, including narrow mountain passes where an ambush would be difficult to defend against. The terrorist group they were tracking had conducted similar attacks in the past, using overwhelming force to quickly overwhelm security and disappear into the countryside with their captives. The briefing lasted 2 hours, covering every aspect of the planned operation: routes, communication protocols, contingency plans for different scenarios. Sarah made notes on her tactical pad, already thinking through the challenges they would face. This wasn't like the compound raid, where they had controlled the timing and approach. This time, they would be reacting to enemy actions, always a more dangerous position to be in. After the briefing ended, Morrison pulled Sarah aside in the hallway. He wanted to talk about what had happened at the compound gate with the boy. He admitted that he had been angry with her in that moment, thinking she was taking an unnecessary risk. But after learning more about the boy's story, he understood why she had made that choice. Sarah appreciated his honesty, but explained that she hadn't been thinking about long-term consequences in that moment. She had simply seen a scared kid and made a split-second decision based on instinct rather than tactical calculation. Sometimes in combat, you had to trust your gut even when it went against your training. They talked for a few more minutes about the upcoming convoy mission, discussing tactics and potential problems they might encounter. Morrison was worried about the terrain. All those narrow passes and choke points where the team would have limited options if things went wrong. Sarah shared his concerns but reminded him that they had successfully completed dozens of missions in similar environments. They would adapt and overcome whatever challenges arose. The convoy was scheduled to depart in 3 days, which gave the team time to prepare equipment and review their plans. Sarah spent those days checking and rechecking her gear, making sure everything was in perfect working order. She cleaned her rifle until it gleamed, tested her communication equipment repeatedly, and studied the maps until she could visualize every turn in the route. On the morning of the mission, the team loaded into 2 unmarked vehicles and left the base before dawn. They drove for several hours to reach the convoy's starting point, a small town where the aid organization had established a temporary distribution center. The convoy itself consisted of 5 large trucks loaded with food, medicine, and supplies for villages that had been cut off by recent fighting. Sarah watched from a distance as the aid workers conducted their final preparations. They were mostly young people, idealistic volunteers, who believed they could make a difference in this war-torn region. Sarah admired their courage even as she worried about their naivety. They had no idea how dangerous this journey would be, and that was probably for the best. Fear would only make them more vulnerable. The convoy departed at noon, the trucks rumbling slowly along the dusty road. Sarah's team followed at a distance of about 2 kilometers, staying far enough back to remain invisible, but close enough to respond quickly if needed. They drove in silence, each team member alert and focused on their assigned sector of observation. The first day passed without incident. The convoy made good progress, covering nearly 80 kilometers before stopping for the night at a secure compound run by local authorities. Sarah's team set up a covert observation post on a hill overlooking the compound, taking turns on watch while the others rested. During her watch shift, Sarah scanned the surrounding area through night vision binoculars. The landscape was eerily beautiful in the green glow of the optics, all harsh shadows and stark contrasts. She watched for any sign of movement, any indication that hostile forces were watching the convoy just as she was, around midnight. Morrison relieved her, and Sarah tried to get some sleep in the back of the vehicle. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by dreams of the compound raid and the boy with the rifle. In her dreams, the boy pulled the trigger, and Sarah watched helplessly as everything went wrong. She woke with her heart pounding, grateful to escape the nightmare back into reality. The second day began with a problem. One of the convoy trucks had developed mechanical issues overnight, and the aid workers were debating whether to continue with 4 trucks or wait for repairs. After 2 hours of discussion and attempts to fix the problem, they decided to leave the broken truck behind and redistribute its cargo among the other vehicles. This delay put them behind schedule and meant they would have to travel through the most dangerous mountain. Pass later in the afternoon than planned. Sarah didn't like it. Traveling in daylight through a known ambush site was asking for trouble. She radioed Commander Richards back at base, explaining the situation and requesting permission to advise the convoy to wait until morning. Richards denied the request. The mission parameters were clear: covert security only. No direct contact with the convoy unless an attack was in progress. Revealing their presence would compromise operational security and potentially make the aid workers targets for future attacks. Sarah understood the reasoning, but still didn't like it. Sometimes following orders meant accepting risk you would rather avoid. The convoy entered the mountain pass around 4 in the afternoon. The road narrowed to barely 2 lanes, with steep rocky slopes rising on one side and a sheer drop-off on the other. It was exactly the kind of terrain that made Sarah's tactical instincts scream danger. Her team had positioned themselves ahead of the convoy, moving on foot now to maintain stealth. Sarah was using her binoculars to scan the slopes above the road when she spotted movement. Just a flash of reflected light, there and gone in an instant. Could have been nothing, just the sun glinting off a rock. But Sarah's experience told her otherwise. She signaled to Morrison and pointed to the location where she had seen the flash. Morrison looked through his scope for several seconds before responding. He saw it too. Someone was up there on the slope, watching the road. He counted at least 3 positions, possibly more hidden in the rocks. Sarah immediately radioed the rest of the team with a warning. They had company, and an attack was likely imminent. The convoy continued forward, unaware of the danger waiting ahead. Sarah's team moved into position, spreading out along the slopes to flank the enemy positions. They had maybe 5 minutes before the trucks reached the ambush kill zone. Sarah's heart rate increased as adrenaline flooded her system, sharpening her senses and preparing her body for combat. She could see the enemy fighters now, at least a dozen of them armed with rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. They were positioned perfectly to devastate the convoy, with overlapping fields of fire that would leave the aid workers with nowhere to hide. The fighters were focused on the road below, not expecting any threat from behind. Sarah made a quick tactical assessment. Her team was outnumbered, but they had surprise and superior positioning. If they acted fast and coordinated their fire, they could neutralize most of the enemy before the ambush began. She gave rapid orders over the radio, assigning targets to each team member and coordinating the timing of their first volley. The convoy trucks were 300 meters away from the kill zone when Sarah gave the order to fire. 6 SEAL rifles opened up simultaneously, precision fire that dropped 6 enemy fighters before they could react. The remaining fighters scattered, some returning fire blindly, while others tried to flee down the opposite slope. Sarah was already moving to a new position, her rifle tracking another target. She fired 3 rounds, center mass, and the fighter crumpled. Morrison took out 2 more who were trying to set up a machine gun. The fight was over in less than 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds were pure chaos. When the shooting stopped, 12 enemy fighters lay dead or wounded on the mountainside. Sarah's team had suffered no casualties, though Sanchez had taken a round through the sleeve of his jacket that somehow missed his arm entirely. The convoy trucks had stopped on the road below, aid workers probably terrified by the sudden eruption of gunfire echoing through the pass. Sarah knew they couldn't maintain their covert posture now. The aid workers had heard the battle, and they would demand answers. She made the decision to break cover and approach the convoy, identifying herself and her team as military security. It was better to reveal their presence than to leave the civilians in confused terror. The aid workers were indeed terrified when Sarah and her team emerged from the rocks. The convoy leader, a British woman named Elizabeth, who couldn't have been older than 30, demanded to know what was happening. Sarah explained calmly that they had been providing security and had just prevented an ambush. She showed Elizabeth the enemy positions up on the slope as proof. Elizabeth's fear quickly turned to anger. She accused Sarah of endangering them by bringing military personnel near their humanitarian mission. The aid organization had a strict policy of neutrality, and the presence of armed soldiers violated that policy. Sarah listened patiently to the lecture before pointing out the obvious. Without military intervention, Elizabeth and her colleagues would currently be hostages or corpses. The argument was interrupted by Morrison calling out a warning. More vehicles were approaching from ahead, probably reinforcements for the ambush team or civilians who had heard the gunfire. Sarah made another quick decision. The convoy needed to turn around immediately and find an alternate route. Staying on this road was too dangerous now that the enemy knew their position. Elizabeth refused at first, insisting they had to complete their mission and deliver the supplies to the villages that desperately needed them. Sarah understood the commitment, but explained that dead aid workers couldn't help anyone. The argument consumed precious seconds while the unknown vehicles drew closer. Finally, Elizabeth agreed to turn around, but only if Sarah's team would escort them through an alternate route to reach at least some of the target villages. Sarah agreed, though she knew this would extend the mission by days and increase the risk to her team. She radioed Commander Richards to explain the situation and request authorization for the extended mission. Richards was not happy about the change in plans, but he recognized that Sarah had limited options at this point. He authorized the extended mission, but warned that extraction would be delayed. They would be operating in unsupported territory. Sarah acknowledged and began working with Elizabeth to plan an alternate route that would avoid known danger zones while still reaching villages in need. The convoy turned around carefully on the narrow mountain road, a nerve-wracking process that involved multiple point turns with sheer drops just inches from the wheels. Sarah's team maintained security, watching for threats from both directions. The approaching vehicles had stopped about a kilometer away, apparently unwilling to advance into what might be a trap. Once the convoy was moving back the way they had come, Sarah and her team took up positions in the lead vehicle, directing the route. They would travel south for 30 kilometers, then cut east through a series of smaller roads that were less likely to be monitored by hostile forces. It would add 2 days to the journey, but Sarah believed it was their best chance of completing the mission without further combat. Night fell as they traveled, and Sarah made the decision to keep moving rather than stop. Movement in darkness was risky on these rough roads, but stopping made them a stationary target. The convoy's headlights cut through the blackness, illuminating the dusty road ahead. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of the lead truck, her rifle across her lap, eyes constantly scanning for danger. Around midnight, they reached a small village where Elizabeth knew the local elder. The convoy stopped there to rest and refuel. The villagers greeted them warmly, offering tea and food despite their own obvious poverty. Sarah was touched by their generosity, but remained vigilant, posting team members around the village perimeter to watch for any threats. Elizabeth used the stop to negotiate with the village elder about changing their route. He confirmed that the main road through the mountains had become too dangerous in recent weeks. With multiple attacks on travelers, he suggested an even longer alternate route that would add another day, but would keep them away from areas controlled by terrorist groups. Sarah joined the discussion, asking questions about the suggested route and the security situation in different areas. The elder was knowledgeable and seemed genuinely concerned for their safety. He offered to provide a local guide who knew the back roads and could help them avoid trouble. Sarah accepted gratefully, recognizing that local knowledge was often more valuable than any intelligence report. The guide's name was Rashid, a man in his 50s who had spent his entire life in these mountains. He spoke some English and proved to be excellent at reading the terrain and spotting potential dangers. With Rashid leading the way, the convoy set out again before dawn, taking roads that barely deserved the name. For 2 days, they traveled through some of the most remote regions Sarah had ever seen. Villages clung to mountainsides, accessible only by narrow tracks that wound through steep valleys. The aid workers delivered supplies at each stop. Greeted by people who had seen few outsiders in months or even years, Sarah found herself impressed by the aid workers' dedication despite her initial skepticism. They worked tirelessly, unloading heavy boxes in brutal heat, treating medical conditions with limited supplies, documenting the needs of communities that had been forgotten by the rest of the world. Elizabeth, for all her earlier anger, proved to be a competent leader who genuinely cared about the people they were helping. On the third day of the revised route, they reached a larger town that served as a regional trading center. Elizabeth wanted to stop there for several hours to assess the medical needs of a refugee camp on the outskirts. Sarah agreed but insisted on conducting a security sweep first. She took Morrison and Wu into the camp while the convoy waited at a safe distance. The camp was a sprawling collection of tents and makeshift shelters, home to thousands of people displaced by the fighting. Sarah had seen refugee camps before, but the conditions here were particularly harsh. Children played in the dust between tents, their bellies swollen from malnutrition. Women queued at a single water pump, the only source of clean water for miles. The smell of human waste and sickness hung heavy in the air. As Sarah conducted her sweep, moving through the narrow passages between tents, she heard a familiar voice speaking in Pashto. She stopped and listened carefully, trying to place where she had heard that voice before. Then it came to her, the man from the basement, the one who had held the gun to the hostage's head. His voice had that same high-pitched quality, the same cadence. Sarah moved toward the sound, her hand resting on her holstered pistol. She rounded a corner between two tents and saw a man talking to a group of refugees. He had his back to her, but the body language was wrong. Too alert, too aware of his surroundings. This wasn't a refugee. This was someone who didn't belong here. The man must have sensed her presence because he suddenly stopped talking and started to turn. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She drew her pistol and commanded him to freeze in English, then repeated it in Pashto. The man's hand moved toward his jacket, and Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. Morrison appeared from another direction, his rifle aimed at the man. Wu came from yet another angle, creating a triangle of fire with no escape route. The man slowly raised his hands, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He said something in Pashto that Sarah didn't understand, but the tone was mocking, almost amused. Sarah approached carefully, keeping her pistol trained on the man's center mass. She ordered him to turn around slowly and get on his knees. He complied, still wearing that unsettling smile. As he turned, Sarah got her first clear look at his face. He wasn't the man from the basement, but there was a family resemblance. Another brother, perhaps, or a cousin. Morrison zip-tied the man's hands while Sarah searched him. She found a pistol, 2 cell phones, and a thick envelope of cash. One of the phones was still warm, recently used. Sarah bagged everything as evidence and helped Morrison get the man to his feet. They needed to move him away from the refugee camp before he attracted attention, or his associates realized he had been captured. They were halfway back to the convoy when Sarah's radio crackled with an urgent message from Sanchez. Multiple vehicles approaching fast from the north, at least 6 of them, heavily armed. Sanchez estimated they would reach the convoy's position in less than 3 minutes. It was clearly a coordinated attack, probably triggered when their prisoner failed to check in with his handlers. Sarah made a split-second decision. She ordered Morrison to take the prisoner back to the convoy while she and Wu set up a delaying position to slow down the attacking vehicles. Morrison protested, wanting to stay and fight, but Sarah cut him off. The convoy needed to start moving immediately, and Morrison was the only one who could coordinate that, while she bought them time. She and Wu took positions behind a low wall that ran along the road leading to the town. It wasn't great cover, but it would have to do. They could see the dust cloud from the approaching vehicles now, maybe 2 kilometers away, and closing fast. Sarah checked her ammunition and prepared herself mentally for what was coming. The first vehicle appeared around a bend in the road about 800 meters away. Sarah let it come closer, wanting to maximize the effect of their ambush. At 400 meters, she opened fire, aiming for the vehicle's engine block. Wu focused on the tires. The vehicle swerved wildly as its front tire exploded, then ground to a halt as steam poured from the damaged radiator. Fighters jumped out of the disabled vehicle and took cover, returning fire. Sarah and Wu had already shifted positions, moving to new spots along the wall. The other vehicles had stopped behind the first, creating a traffic jam on the narrow road. That bought the convoy maybe 2 or 3 extra minutes, but now Sarah and Wu were pinned down by superior numbers. Sarah's radio crackled. Morrison reported that the convoy was moving, taking a back road out of town that Rashid had suggested. They would meet at a rally point 10 kilometers to the south. Sarah acknowledged and told Wu it was time to go. They had done what they came to do: delay the enemy long enough for the convoy to escape. They moved backwards through the town, using buildings for cover as bullets zinged past them. The enemy fighters were advancing cautiously, not sure how many defenders they faced. Sarah and Wu used that uncertainty to their advantage, firing from different positions to make it seem like there were more of them. They reached the edge of town, where Sanchez was waiting with one of the team vehicles. Sarah and Wu piled in, and Sanchez floored the accelerator, racing down a narrow alley that opened onto a dirt road heading south. Behind them, Sarah could hear the enemy vehicles entering the town, their engines roaring as they searched for their prey. The chase lasted 20 minutes, the longest 20 minutes of Sarah's life. Sanchez drove like a man possessed, somehow keeping the vehicle upright as they bounced and slid over the rough terrain. Sarah and Wu leaned out the windows, firing at the pursuing vehicles whenever they got close enough for a clear shot. They shot out tires, shattered windshields, and forced their pursuers to slow down repeatedly. But the enemy kept coming, determined to catch them. Sarah knew they couldn't keep this up forever. Their ammunition was running low, and eventually the vehicle would hit something or the engine would give out. Then salvation appeared in the form of a helicopter. Sarah heard the rotors before she saw it, a beautiful sound that meant help had arrived. The helicopter swooped down, a gunship from the base that Commander Richards had scrambled when he heard about the attack. Its weapons spoke with thunder, tearing into the pursuing vehicles with devastating accuracy. The enemy broke off the chase immediately, scattering in different directions to escape the helicopter's guns. Sanchez didn't slow down, continuing south toward the rally point where the rest of the team waited with the convoy. Sarah slumped in her seat, exhaustion washing over her now that the immediate danger had passed. They reached the rally point an hour later. The convoy was there, parked in a defensive circle with Sarah's team providing security. Elizabeth rushed over when Sarah climbed out of the vehicle, her face pale with worry. She wanted to know what had happened, if everyone was okay. Sarah gave her a brief summary while checking on her team. Everyone had made it out safely, though Sanchez had taken a bullet graze on his arm during the chase. Morrison had secured the prisoner in one of the trucks, and the man was now sitting sullenly with his hands still zip-tied behind his back. The helicopter pilot radioed that he would provide escort for the remainder of the convoy's journey. With air support overhead, the risk of another attack dropped significantly. Elizabeth wanted to continue the mission, delivering the remaining supplies to villages that still needed them. Sarah agreed, recognizing that running back to base now would mean all this had been for nothing. Over the next 2 days, they completed the supply deliveries under the watchful eyes of the helicopter above. The villagers they helped were grateful beyond words, many of them in tears as they received food and medicine. Sarah watched as Elizabeth and her team worked tirelessly, treating sick children and elderly people who had nowhere else to turn. In quiet moments between deliveries, Sarah found herself thinking about the bigger picture. This war had been going on for so long that everyone was tired, both the fighters and the civilians caught in the middle. Young men picked up rifles because they saw no other path, boys like the one who had let her go at the compound gate. And people like Elizabeth kept coming to help despite the danger because they believed they could make a difference. On the final day of the mission, as they approached the base, Elizabeth came to sit beside Sarah in the lead truck. She apologized for her earlier anger, admitting that she hadn't fully understood the dangers they were facing. Sarah accepted the apology gracefully, explaining that she too had learned something from the experience. She had learned that courage came in many forms. It wasn't just about carrying a gun and facing down enemies. It was also about crossing the world to help strangers. About delivering supplies when you knew people wanted to kill you for it. About believing you could make things better, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. The convoy pulled through the base gates to cheers from other personnel who had been following their progress. The supplies had been delivered, the aid workers were safe, and they had captured a significant enemy operative. By any measure, the mission was a success. Sarah helped unload the prisoner and turn him over to intelligence officers for questioning. She learned later that he was indeed related to the man from the basement, a network of brothers who had been operating terrorist cells throughout the region. His capture led to more arrests and disrupted planned attacks that could have killed dozens of people. That evening, Sarah sat outside her quarters watching the sun set over the mountains. Morrison joined her, bringing 2 bottles of water and sitting down without saying anything. They sat in companionable silence for a while, just enjoying the peace after days of constant stress. Finally, Morrison spoke. He wanted to know if she ever thought about leaving, going home, and trying to find a normal life. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. She told him she'd thought about it sometimes, especially after missions like this one. But then she remembered the faces of the people they had helped. The aid workers who depended on them, the boy who chose peace over violence. As long as there were people worth protecting and causes worth fighting for, Sarah knew she would keep doing this job. It wasn't an easy life, and it came with costs that she felt every day. But it was meaningful work, and in a world full of confusion and chaos, meaning was something worth holding on to. 3 months after the convoy mission, Sarah received a letter from Germany. It was from the woman she had rescued from the basement, the hostage whose life had hung by a thread. The woman had recovered physically and was working through her trauma with professional help. She wanted Sarah to know that she was grateful for every day she got to live now, and that she would never forget the courage Sarah had shown. The letter ended with a simple message: "Thank you for giving me tomorrow." Sarah read those words several times, feeling the weight of responsibility they represented. She had been given the power to make life or death decisions in split seconds. And somehow, she had managed to make mostly good ones. She thought about the enemy fighter in the basement, the one who had pointed a gun at an innocent woman's head. His decision to threaten violence had led to his capture and the disruption of a terrorist network. She thought about the boy at the gate, who had chosen mercy and found a new life away from violence. And she thought about Elizabeth and her team choosing to help despite the danger because it was the right thing to do. All these choices, big and small, shaped the world in ways that rippled far beyond the immediate moment. Sarah understood now that her job wasn't just about completing missions or following orders. It was about making choices that reflected the kind of world she wanted to live in. Even when those choices were hard or dangerous or went against tactical doctrine, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in her locker, next to her equipment and personal items. Tomorrow would bring another briefing, another mission, another series of impossible choices. But tonight, she would rest knowing that her choices had mattered, that they had created tomorrow for someone who might not have had one otherwise. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself drift towards sleep. The sounds of the bass humming around her, the weight of responsibility settling comfortably on her shoulders. She was ready for whatever came next because she knew who she was and what she fought for. In the end, that clarity was all any soldier could ask for.